This weekend I was at Frightfest, a film festival full of phantasmagorical frights to feast upon. And now I've run out of F-words. Hello friends and neighbours, my name is Strange Fish, but if you're feeling friendly, you can call me Feety. Glasgow Frightfest 2025 has just finished. That's 2 days of horror films hosted by the Frightfest team. Paul McAvoy, Ian Rattray, Alan Jones and Greg Day. 4 friendly and very approachable chaps, not that I ever have or ever will approach them because I am a socially inept coward. They've been running these events for over 20 years, bringing together an array of horror films from across the globe and of every subgenre, along with Q&As from directors, writers and actors, as well as showcasing short films and independent filmmakers. The main Frightfest event happens down in London round about August and has expanded to be featured over multiple screens. I think they're up to about 70 films per event, which is great for most normal people who've got plenty to choose from, but it's very awkward for indecisive people like me who end up standing in the lobby going, I don't know, because I'm worried I'm going to miss out on something. I've only been to the London event twice because it's London and London is scary and I'm just a tiny little girl on her lonesome. And I am glad that they also have a smaller event up in Glasgow because sometimes people forget about us up here. Having said that, I sometimes think that us being the smaller event leads to us not getting the highest quality of films. The guys always do their best to get great films and guests, but I think production companies are probably reluctant to showcase their stuff here. They'd rather wait for the main event in London. That seemed very apparent last year and fairly apparent this year, as I didn't really come out of it with any one film that I thought was brilliant and wanted to recommend to people. Except Heart of Darkness, the documentary about the making of the final Friday the 13th movie. I thoroughly enjoyed that one. Adam Marquis, director of Jason Goes to Hell, was present at the screening for a little chat sesh and some Q&A, and he seems like a genuinely nice and fun guy, with a lot of love for the film and the genre as a whole. That and this documentary reminded me of why I love this kind of genre filmmaking so much, because it is made by people who love what they do, are genuine fans of the genre, and like to be fairly hands-on with things. The documentary includes several interviews with cast and crew, and is a very loving and warm retelling of the making of the film from concept to inception, as well as looking at its journey from most divisive Jason movie
It was the worst garbage in the world.
I was actually disappointed.
to cult classic.
Here we are, all these years later, still talking about it.
Now, I'm outing myself as a fake horror fan here, because I haven't seen Jason Goes to Hell, or most of the Jason movies to be honest. I keep intending to binge them, but I really do want to binge them all at once, so I've just never blocked out the time to do it. So I went into this documentary knowing next to nothing about it, and got a good lot of information and enjoyment out of it. Someone who is more immersed in the movies and knows all the lore might have had a different experience, but overall I thought it was very well made, very enjoyable, and it seemed to get a very good reaction from the audience. Probably the highlight of the weekend for me. Since I seem to have started with my favourite, I might as well carry on and do this as a sort of tier list from best to worst. And next best would be a toss-up between two, but I'm going to go with Mother's Embrace. I try not to judge a movie by its synopsis. I nearly made that mistake with this film and very nearly didn't go, because it was on day 2 and it started at 10:45 after I had only managed to get home at 1:15 in the morning. So I was all the tired. I was debating between sleep or film, and I chose film, and I'm glad I did. The description sounded fairly run-of-the-mill. Firefighter goes to help evacuate an old folks' home during a terrible storm and floods, but finds something sinister under the surface, under the guise of innocence, and has to confront their own traumatic past while battling this new evil. It didn't jump out at me as groundbreaking or anything, but it turned out to be a really enjoyable movie. Not perfect by any means, and characters would sometimes make questionable decisions, but then don't they always in horror movies? Well acted, well shot, with some very creepy imagery, especially around eyes, and with a slight Lovecraftian element to it. I say that with a question mark because I don't really know that I know what I'm talking about. What I mean is that it has some things not quite right here vibes, as well as some tentacle play and a bit of Elder God stuff. It doesn't feel Lovecraft, but it has those elements. It also gave me a sort of baby's first wreck feeling, meaning I thought it was good and eerie and had a similar thing of wandering around a building. That's the only similarity apparently my brain could think of right now. And although our main girl was well acted and seemed very likeable and nice, she didn't have enough of a personality, I think, for me to actually care about what happens to her. I didn't feel completely invested. Maybe that's a me problem, I don't know. Maybe I'm just heartless. I don't think it'll be one that will go on the DVD shelf. Yes, I still collect DVDs, but it was an enjoyable watch and worth seeing at least once. Possibly controversially, I'm going to put The Doombusters in position 3 on the list. Not because I liked it less than Mother's Embrace, possibly just as much, maybe even a little more. Maybe I should have put it the other way. I don't know. But it was a big pile of silly, and I like a big pile of silly. Judging by the audience reaction, this might have even been the favourite of the weekend. I have a soft spot for the silly and the goofy. Doesn't necessarily have to be a comedy, but it just has to have fun with what it's doing. This one is a comedy and it does have fun. The main note I scribbled down about it was if Dad's Army was 18 rated. You may have to be British to appreciate this one. It plays on old British sitcoms and quirky stereotypical bumbling characters, and in particular one called Dad's Army, a sitcom about the Home Guard during WW2. British Home Guard was usually made up of older men or younger men with medical exemptions, but who still wanted to do their bit. And I don't think they ever saw any action. No armies ever invaded Britain during the war. Unless you count the ones from Bedknobs and Broomsticks that literally got their butts kicked by anthropomorphised suits of armour. The Doombusters features 3 young men in their army, and it plays into the feel of the old British sitcoms with silly setups, cheesy dialogue, slight innuendo, and over-the-top caricatures. Our team are sent off on a training exercise where they meet up with spunky landgirl Edith, who Enid Blytons her way through the whole film, and my next obscure Halloween costume, 1940s nurse with a Tommy gun. They find themselves coming up against a force not made up of German soldiers but of extraterrestrial origin. And it's up to these inept, overgrown Boy Scouts to save the Earth from desolation. It's a lot of fun and the characters are very endearing. Plenty of laughs along the way and a fairly satisfying ending, which is more than can be said for a lot of the films. By the Throat was what I've heard people call a slow burn, but I don't want you to think I'm being boring by that. It was well written and well paced, and I found it to be a compelling story for the most part. They played awkward well. I know that sounds strange, but they played awkward well. Lizzie has come to house sit Alex and help care for his wife Amy, who has been struggling after the death of her young daughter and barely leaves her bed anymore. The conversations between Lizzie and the young couple are appropriately awkward and stiff, and the acting is very good. It almost feels like fly on the wall with how natural some of the dialogue comes across. Not all of it or every actor, but the main 3 are good, and there are some good clumps of natural chat. The first part of the film plays out like a drama with Lizzie tending to the house and making meals for Amy, interspersed with flashbacks to Lizzie's own trauma dump backstory and phone calls to her mother. Speaking of the mother, I was kind of hoping for a mum-off at one point in the film. Lizzie's mum against the grieving mum, but it never happened, which is sad. I don't know if I should share my thoughts about what I thought was going to happen, but I will anyway. Partway through, I got the feeling that Amy might be trying to replace her child with Lizzie. There was one point where she gets her all dressed up for dinner, and I was fully expecting her to show up in front of Alex and him to be all surprised because those were his daughter's dresses. Because Lizzie is quite small, she's a very petite young lady, and we never were told how old the daughter was. She could have been a teenager. And I did think that Amy was going to try and make Lizzie replace her daughter and keep her captive, and then we would have Lizzie's mum coming into the rescue, and we could have a battle of the mums. That might have been more interesting than the way it did end up. It built a good claustrophobic, uncomfortable atmosphere, and the acting was very good. But when it got to the ending, I was a bit, oh, we're doing this now, are we? It's hard to describe it without spoilers, and I don't want to be a spoiler monkey, but turns from an interesting tale to a fairly standard slog. And I didn't get my mum battle, so I was disappointed. I sound like I didn't like this film, but I actually kind of did. I just wished the ending had gone differently. I have put Scared to Death next on my list because it made me laugh. It's very silly, but very thin. Not quite the parody of horror, but with parody-like characters. It follows a young, aspiring filmmaker as he slogs through being a PA for a dickish boss. Although it then stops following him and he starts to feel more like a side piece than a main man. He ends up being just there. They are making a horror movie, and PA Jasper suggests that they all go to a real haunted house and do a real seance. And it's just so happened that he has already met the perfect medium and scouted the perfect location, an old children's home where 5 orphans tragically lost their lives, apparently scared to death. They all gather in the house, seance begins, and spooky happens. I don't have much quibble with the spooky or the orphan death backstory, because it's a comedy and it's meant to be a bit of silly. But if this part had been better and less cliché and less messy, it would have made for a much better film. Which is a silly thing to say. If it had been better, it would have been better. The director was there talking about the film and said that they had thought about going more scary at first and then pivoted away from it, partly because of the inclusion of Lynn Shay. Now, we all know her as that spooky woman who plays spooky mediums in spooky movies, but she also is a really good comedic actor and pulls out all the silly for this role. But she does not play the medium this time. Mainly because she kind of said, been there, done that, I don't want to do that. Instead, she plays the nightmare boss with a little bit of a substance problem, and spends most of the time incapacitated. Lynn Shay is probably the best part of this film, seconded only by Greg the Grog Grogstone, who is this universe's horror icon, akin to a Kane Hodder, and famous for playing all the movie monsters in probably low-budget horrors. It's a wonderfully cheesy character, and I use the word character loosely because apparently that's just what the actor himself is like, including his biker-like clothing and his little wibbly chin beard. Not the best actor, but a lot of fun, and most of the comedy revolved around him and his back catalogue, as well as Lynn Shay and her comically rubbery facial expressions. After having been disappointed by some and confused by other films during this lineup, this one was a welcome chuckle. Starting to sound like a theme, but I can't necessarily say that it was good. But it was fun, and it made me giggle. If you come across it on streaming, give it a watch. Maybe don't spend any money on it though. The Last Sacrifice was the first documentary of the weekend on Friday, and was quite enjoyable to watch. It takes a look at the rise of witchcraft and paganism in Britain in the 50s and 60s, and the influence this had on horror, particularly the folk horror genre, particularly The Wicker Man. That's This Wicker Man with Iwa Wuwa, not This Wicker Man with the bees. The main focus is supposed to be on the unusual death of Charles Walton and its possible connection to witchcraft, and its influence on the film The Wicker Man. And I say supposed to be because it feels like it loses its way a little bit, repeating itself at times and veering off to just talk about witchcraft and look at other documentaries. It's kind of like when I talk without a script and I just jump from one topic to the next as it just jumps into my head before remembering what I'm supposed to be talking about and coming back to it only to say, well, I don't know. It is made up of, I think, some stock footage, forgive me if I'm wrong, but mostly clips from other folk horror movies and documentaries about covens in Britain. The interviews with the various people in and around the witchy world are interesting and amusing and probably the best part of it, if you don't include the after credits ending, which is definitely worth waiting for. It had a strong start with some good editing, but it seemed to lose momentum in some places before picking it back up again. Was the only one that I very nearly nodded off in, even though it did give me a good few laughs. It kind of follows the same theme that all the other films had in that it was superficially enjoyable, but falls apart on too close an inspection. American Backyard. I watch films like this and then wonder if I'm just not brainy or sophisticated enough to appreciate its artistic vision. I was very grateful to overhear my seatmates say that they also were confused. This is a film by Papi Avati about a young Italian man who falls in love with an American nurse. I put that in bunny ears because he sees her once for a few seconds and gives her directions to somewhere, and that's it. He's in love. I don't think you're supposed to take the him being in love seriously, more that he's infatuated and maybe a little spookily so, I don't know. But that's the opening to the film. Next we then follow him as he moves to America for a short time on a house exchange, which I didn't even know was a thing. And coincidentally, the house that he moves into is right next door to the house of the mother of the girl he fell in love with. Was that a confusing sentence? Coincidentally, the house he moves to is right next door to the mother of American Nurse. Only Nursey has gone missing, presumed dead. And her distraught mother is unable to come to terms with this and wants, at the very least, some closure. Our Italian friend, who I'll be honest I can't remember the name of, decides to help out this old lady. helping her to wash herself in exchange for a small fee, which isn't odd at all. So far, you would be forgiven for forgetting that this was a horror movie. I genuinely did and thought I was watching some lovelorn melodrama. Just as I was starting to get a bit bored, our friend uncovers a something in the old lady's back garden, and then the old lady dies, giving him a box of old letters and a request to find out what happened to her daughter. This starts him on a strange scavenger quest back to Italy, where he befriends a man whose brother is on trial for murder, and the murderer might have something to do with the nurse's disappearance. And then we just watch a courtroom for a long while. I believe it's supposed to be a psychological horror of sorts, but the horror is very subtle, if there at all. Our friend is like an interloper stepping in and out of various people's lives. And I think that some of the interest came from the slightly changing perspectives we had of the characters when he heard about them, met them, and then talked about them after the fact. And I was happily going along with the story, hoping that I would start to understand it and that something would happen. Not much does. It interests me enough that I want to learn more about it, which I think is kind of what you have to do with films like this. They can't just be watched and then put away. You have to dig deep into them. If it wasn't a brand new film, I would be heading to the reaction and theory section of YouTube to see what other people thought of it, and if they had any explanations. Then I would re-watch it to see if any of my newfound knowledge gave me a different perspective. That's what I think a film like this needs, a bit of re-watching and a little bit of digging and analysis. The only reason I'm putting it this low down on the list is because I walked out of it feeling very confused and unsatisfied. It was the weirdest non-ending of any film I have ever watched, with nothing answered and no closure or conclusion. Very pretty in velvety black and white, but what did I just watch? I have no clue. House of Ashes had an interesting sounding concept and an interesting setup, and went nowhere with it. Mia is a woman who has been accused and acquitted of her husband's murder when it is ultimately ruled a suicide. And to make matters worse, she's on house arrest for having a miscarriage. In the world where this movie is set, something that no woman has any control over and is traumatic enough is now also punishable by law. And frighteningly, this isn't that far from our reality, as there are at least 22 countries where abortion is illegal, and many more when there are limitations and conditions attached to it. And there have been women already arrested for miscarrying. So this does sound like the setup for a really eerie, really creepy, really topical dystopian horror. But apart from a few comments at the beginning of the movie, the story is largely forgotten about. Mia's struggles are mostly about getting over the death of her husband and having to shift all of his stuff out of the house while not being quite ready to get rid of it. Her other problem is that she has a really shit boyfriend. She might also be being haunted, or going mad, but mostly it's the boyfriend that's the problem. And not just because the acting is bad. Kind of stiff and clunky and robotic. And it doesn't help that the dialogue is pretty clunky too, with a lot of exposition about their backstory. Despite the fact that they both grew up together and therefore would know their backstories and wouldn't have to tell it to each other. Mia being on house arrest, regardless of the reason, could still have been a fun setup. She is being haunted or something and can't leave her house. And she has a very unsympathetic and farcically aggressive parole officer who is never going to give her any leeway. And boyfriend doesn't believe her. She can't even leave to go across the road or down to a neighbour's house or out for a coffee just to get a break from whatever's going on. But that doesn't enter into the story either. She never seems that fussed about staying in the house. She never seems desperate to leave or tries more than once. I think when she does try to leave the house just that one time, it comes across more like agoraphobia than worried about the repercussions. I don't really feel like it flows very smoothly. I mean, that might be intentionally artistic, as it gives me sort of art house vibes with certain strange shots and angles and weird colourful lighting. I don't really understand art house. And maybe I would have gotten more out of this if I did. But I think there were a lot more problems than just that. It elicited a lot of giggles from the audience, but I'm not sure that all of them were intended. Somewhere, there were clear moments where it was obvious it was meant to be funny. but a lot more where it felt more like laughing at than laughing with. There were moments that didn't make sense and didn't go anywhere and seemed pointless. Like Mia picks up a knife and stares at it, mesmerised, as if she's thinking about using it, but none of the deaths that happened prior to the movie starting had anything to do with the knife, and she doesn't seem like she's suicidal in any way or shape or form, and it doesn't come up again. Her having space out moments or anything like that. The boyfriend also goes off to have a shower. Mia goes to check on him, and when she opens the door, I quite liked this shot though. She walks in to the hall, which is dark. She opens the door to the bathroom, which lets light into the hall, which highlights the boyfriend standing in the corner, just staring. And I don't think there's any sting either, which I appreciate. But then why was he Blair Witching in the corner? Does that ever come up again? No, I don't get it. And then the ending took a strange turn, and kind of boring turn, and a kind of cheesy, weird turn. It turned, and it turned sour. On the plus side, Fania Sanchez, who plays Mia, was great. I thought her acting was fantastic, especially with how difficult some of the dialogue was, and how unnatural sounding they were. She spent a lot of the movie in varying states of distress, and it was very compelling and moving. But I'm afraid that's the only nice thing I have to say about it. And finally we have Rumplestiltskin. I had hope for this one. I thought it was either going to be a creepy, dark, gothic-y fairy tale, or a so bad it's good, like a Leprechaun or a Sharknado. Maybe not taking itself too seriously and just having some fun. It was not. And when it came to taking itself seriously, it did so too much and also not enough. It didn't seem to be able to make its mind up about whether it was going to be ye olde worldy English folktale talk, or modern day isn't it funny when old-timey people say rude words with bad sarcasm, which was distracting and annoying. It's very difficult to get the oldie-timey speak right, and even harder for an actor to pull it off well. So much harder when you make that dialogue fight with "ha ha, he said cock." And some of the actors in this were definitely not up to the task. The actor for Rumplestiltskin was the best of the bunch, but even so I wasn't completely sold on his performance. It grew on me a little, but I wanted him to be scarier and creepier and nastier. I wanted him to feel slimy. He had good physicality with all the way he walked and his little twiddly fingers, which is maybe why I'm doing a lot of twiddly fingers while I'm talking about it. I'm just thinking about it. And he played the mischievous side of Rumplestiltskin very well, the playful, fruity voice, sort of pretending to be your friend thing. But it didn't feel like he did a good turn into the nasty, slimy, this fella could really do me some harm. I think part of this lack of threat might have been down to how wide the shots were and how far away we always felt from everything. For the miller's daughter, in her cell with Rumplestiltskin whispering promises in her ear, I wanted it to be closer in and claustrophobic, giving her a sense of no way out, a sort of feeling of madness and desperation. But Miller's daughter, or MD for short, never seems to be that desperate. She's just sort of snooty and rude. I half expected her to hit out with a whatever and a stop trying to make fetch happen. The chat with the actors and director before the streaming also had the cheek of trying to make it seem like she becomes empowered by taking on Rumplestiltskin all by herself rather than having her guards do it, as if she has somehow grown and wasn't always a self-important brat. To undercut Rumple's big bad even more, there was an even bigger bad, who he calls Master, a poorly CG'd Groot-like monster with a laughably pitch-shifted voice, who orders Frumpy to bring him a child willingly given. So Humpy Gets Spit isn't the big evil, he just works for it. But he still gives MD the chance to not lose her firstborn child, if she can guess his name, which wouldn't really work out in his favour, because if he doesn't get the child, then the big evil drags him to some sort of hellscape. I know Humphrey likes to play games and teasing and doesn't think there's a possibility of her learning his name, but why take that chance? If there was no big evil, then this would all just be part of Grumple's rotten little games, and I would accept that. The big evil itself wasn't even big or evil enough to take the child away, even when he was standing right in front of MD and her son. He just sort of pieced out. I know, child had to be willingly given, But when does a proper big bad not have a loophole for getting what he wants? Everything about this made it feel like a bad amateur pantomime. The dialogue was at odds with itself, with the start of the conversations feeling like a wannabe Jane Austen, and the end like it wanted to be in a spoof by Mel Brooks. And despite the fact that they were partly on location in real castles and old halls, their interior shots looked cheaper than horrible histories. The costumes were really nice though, and the makeup effects for Rumplestiltskin were very good. I think that actor put in that role, but with a different script and director, could do a good turn as the poisonous little imp, but was rather lost in this Amdram sham. And that was it, apart from the short film showcase, which I might talk about in a separate video. All in all, better than last year. I got a good few laughs out of my weekend, and a little bit of well-needed dopamine. But I didn't come home with anything to put on the DVD shelf. Except for Terrifier 3, which I got as a freebie. Which means I might have to go and watch the other films now. Still enjoyed Frightfest, still enjoyed the overall experience of sitting in a crowd of like-minded horror weirdos. I will be back next year because I love those guys, and one day I might even make it back to London. If you are a horror fan, Frightfest London is the place to be. And if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for sticking with me. Please leave a like and a comment, let me know if you were there and if you disagree with most of my uneducated opinions. But just remember to be kind to your friendly neighbourhood fitty, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!